What a ridiculous question. What a ridiculous question Jesus was asked in our gospel lesson that Annie read for us earlier in spite of some preacher who gave her the wrong verse this week. 7 brothers in one family. One marries a woman and dies without having a child. Then his brother marries her in accordance with the law. That brother also dies. In fact, all 7 pass away. The woman passes away. And the burning question the Sadducees need to know when they have Jesus standing right in front of them is, in the resurrection, whose wife will this woman be? Now, what we need to know is that the entire chapter of Luke 20 has been about the temple leaders peppering Jesus with one question after another. It could be called the Jeopardy passage of Luke. Preacher Tom Long called it Jesus' final exam. For months, the lectionary has had us traveling along with Jesus on this journey toward Jerusalem, and in our text this morning, he has finally arrived to the city. And by the time we get to our story, Jesus has already wept over the city. He has already driven out those from the temple who were selling. The chief priests and scribes have already asked Jesus questions like, "By what authority are you doing these things?" And they asked him, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar?" Jesus does what Jesus always does. He turns their questions on their heads with just enough theological nuance to drive them mad. He refuses to tell them where his authority comes from. And on the question of taxes, Jesus tells them, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's." Luke says the leaders were so mad that they would have arrested Jesus in that very moment. It was only their fear of the crowds that kept them from dragging him away. Our text is the first time that the Sadducees have stepped into the Jeopardy round. As Luke says, the Sadducees were the religious leaders who did not believe in the resurrection. For them, this life was all that there was, and there was no life after this present. In Walter Brueggemann's words, they are the big downtown priests. They traffic in power. They realistically live in this world, believing it to be the only world there is or will be. It is as good as it can get in this life, so their job is to keep everything just like it is and maintain it. And so they come up with this absurd hypothetical, but Jesus doesn't take the bait. He says those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage, but in the age to come, they cannot die. Jesus refuses to accept the limitations of this life. And he invited the Sadducees to imagine their belonging in the age that was yet to come. The resurrection age that Jesus spoke of, that age that was breaking into this age when the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. That age, the age to come, will not be limited, Jesus said, to the categories of this world. You see, the Sadducees had assumed, and we all know that old saying about assumptions. I'll not repeat it here. But they had assumed that if there was a resurrection, which they did not believe, then the woman in the story would still be needing to belong to a man. They assumed she would still be an expression of property. They assumed all the binaries and categories and divisions of this age would carry over into the resurrected age. But listen to what Jesus is saying. In this age, people marry and are given in marriage. But in the age of resurrection, the age in process of being completely fulfilled, in that age, things are going to work differently. A few months ago, on a trip to New York, Patrick and I met a young man who was trapped in the confines of this age. He asked us about our marriage, and he shared with us that he was from an Eastern country where at birth he was given in marriage to a young woman. He shared that even though he was gay, he was to wed her upon his return to his home country in just a few weeks' time. There are limitations to this age. In this age, the wealthiest country in the world is sending people to food banks. But in the age to come, God's banquet table is set for all. In this age, death is very real. But in the age of resurrection, death is no more, and every tear is wiped away. In this age, strength is measured by how much you own, by how much is in your bank account. But in the age to come, mercy, compassion, hospitality, and love will carry the weight. The Sadducees assumed this age was God's limit. And I wonder what happens when we do the same thing. When have the limitations of this age's politics or religious tradition or institutions, when have those limitations made us assume that God's future is defined only by what we can understand or imagine? It reminds me one of the last trips I had with my mama a few years ago. We went past the little red brick church that I grew up in back home, and to my dismay, the little brick marquee sign that somebody had to run out there and change every now and then that said Hempill Free Will Baptist Church had been removed. In its place was a sign that seemed to tower above the mountain it was in front of, with a gigantic LED screen that told the weather and the temperature and everything on earth. And I looked at Mama and I said, "Who in the world let them change that sign?" I said, "Why would they go with a sign like that? The whole sign is bigger than the church." And she looked at me and she said, "Well, Jordy, I kind of like the sign. That other one was so small that when you drove by, you couldn't tell what was on it. Now everybody can see." I wasn't done yet. I said, "But Mama, we don't have but 100 people in the church. How many years are we going to be paying off that sign?" And she looked at me and said, "I paid for it." The second time we passed it that day, I told her I thought it looked real good out there. Don't we all get caught up in that kind of limitation from time to time? We cling to what we have been given, to what we've built, because it's solid. And sometimes we can confuse what's solid with what's sacred. But God keeps calling us to life, to being the living people of God. That's what Jesus meant when he said to Peter in Matthew 16, "On this rock I will build my church." He wasn't talking about a rock that never moves. He was talking about a kind of faith rooted in the living God. The God who builds churches not simply out of stone, but out of people like you and me. A few years ago, during a funeral service where there was a lot of talk about resurrection, Hunter Boyd, who Dan Terry had hired to be the gravedigger at our funeral home, came through the back door of the church about during the first song with his hands waving in the air just like this. I've never seen one man get so mad so quick as Dan Terry did in the 10 seconds he was back there waving his hand. Me and Dan snuck back to the back of the church, went outside in the parking lot, and Dan said, "Hunter, what in the world is the matter with you?" And he said, "Dan, we've got a problem at the cemetery." Dan said, "What problem we got at the cemetery?" Hunter said, "Well, we're only about 2 feet down, and we've hit rock." You see, genealogists that study the mountains will tell you that often it does not take long to dig down into the ground and hit the bedrock underneath. The funeral was already happening. We were to be at the cemetery in about an hour, and we had a grave that was 2 foot deep. Dan sprang into action. Me and him and Hunter got in his car and went to the funeral home. He went out to the garage and commenced to looking through what seemed like a mountain of tools. And Dan Terry, in his best dress suit, pulled out a jackhammer. He handed the jackhammer to Hunter and said, "Let's go dig this grave." So we went off to the cemetery. We got out of the car. Dan took off his tie, rolled up his sleeves, and kicked off this pair of Allen Edmond dress shoes that looked much newer those years ago. And he said, "We've got a grave to dig." Put my shoe back on. Dan got out the jackhammer and started working till he got tired. Then Hunter started working till he got tired. And then I started working until I got tired. And if that's not a metaphor for what the church does and for what ministry is, then I don't know what is. So when Jesus looks at the Sadducees and looks at all of us and the limitations we bring in our imaginations and says, God is not God of the dead, but God of the living. For to God, all of them are alive. Jesus is not describing some far away afterlife. He's naming what's possible in the here and the now. For God is the God of the living, because resurrection doesn't only happen when we die. It can happen when we live faithful lives here and now. Amen.